Welcome to possibly the only podcast you're going to listen to this week that isn't about the US elections. This is the Europeans, and my trusty usual co-host Dominic Kramer is away this week, so I'm joined this week by our other resident Amsterdammer. It's producer Katz Laszlo. Hi, Katz.
Hi, Katie.
What a week.
What a week.
How you doing?
Well, I mean, where to even begin to answer that question? Obviously, the news has just come in about the US election, and this isn't a podcast about the US, but I would be lying if I said it didn't influence me at all. And honestly, it's so fresh and huge that I'm feeling pretty numb.
Numb is the word I'm hearing a lot, actually, from American friends today. It's weird. Like, it feels kind of like we've become so used to huge pieces of bad news since about 2016 that Trump's re-election, it doesn't feel at all like his first victory. It is more numbing than last time. Like, the sadness is still there, the anger is still there, but the shock isn't, even though it's still devastating.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's strange. I lived in New York when Trump was elected for the first time, but that feels like decades ago.
And, you know, you and I are talking about this a whole ocean away, but this affects all of us outside the US, you know? I'm thinking about what this means for Ukraine. I'm thinking about what this means for the planet, given Trump's record on climate change. I'm thinking about the Palestinians.
Yeah, I think those are the flashes I've felt so far that pierce through my numbness of like, Jesus Christ, what is this going to mean for so many people? And that's already outside of the US. What is this going to mean for women in the US? Friends, I don't know. There's a lot of people to be worried about today.
And of course, this has also been a terrible week on this side of the Atlantic. And I know that what's been happening in Spain this past week feels very close to home for you in particular, Katz.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely don't want to make it about myself at all. But on yesterday, when we recorded the rest of the show that you're about to hear, I was feeling anything but numb. Most of you listening probably hear a very British accent and will have probably also heard that I live in Amsterdam. But I actually lived in Barcelona for 11 years as a kid. And so these horrific floods in Spain, and most acutely in Valencia, also in Catalonia, in Andalusia, all over the place, they're literally very close to home, at home, and it really shattered through any numbness I feel about the climate crisis. So all week there's been a lot of tears, to be honest.
Yeah.
What also scares me is Trump is famously not great on the climate front. And so it does hit me extra hard that him being the president of one of the biggest and richest countries in the world is only going to be more of these storms.
Well, in a minute, we're going to be talking more about Spain and how to make sense of this terrible disaster. And we figured it's kind of our job here at the Europeans to keep you informed about what is happening on this continent, while a lot of the world's attention is understandably on the US. So we're going to be talking about Spain. We're also going to be talking about another really important election that's just taken place. Moldova's pro-European president Maia Sandu has won re-election despite a huge amount of Russian interference. In your face, Vladimir Putin. We're also going to try and offer a little distraction from the weightiness of all of the news this week. We've got a really lovely interview coming up with two of the people behind a fascinating report into what the kids of Europe are watching these days on those pesky screens of theirs, and what it might mean for a generation of European children to be consuming more and more of the same content. That great interview is coming up in a bit, but first up, it's Good Week, Bad Week.
Good week, bad week.
So, Katz, it's pretty clear who's had a bad week. Let's talk about Spain.
Yes, it has been a very, very horrific week for people across Spain, where a giant storm hit multiple regions, Andalusia, the Balearic Islands, Ceuta, Catalonia, but by far the hardest hit was Valencia. So far, 217 people have been confirmed dead, and only 39 of those people have been identified. There are officially 1,900 people missing, But because the heavy rain carried on for days and the rescue operation has been slow to start, many buildings and garages are still blocked shut, and there are fears those numbers could get a lot higher, but it's all very unclear.
The scale of this thing, it's almost unimaginable. I guess my first question is, did we know that this was coming?
Well, yes and no. So in the days running up to the storm, the National Weather Station IMET was sending increasingly urgent warnings to the Valencian government and also on its own social media, saying that there was an incredibly powerful storm coming, a Dana.
A Dana, yes. I've seen that word in some of the news coverage, but I didn't really know what it meant. So a Dana is a type of storm.
Yeah, so this is a type of storm that's already hit this region for a long time, every year. So over the summer, along the Mediterranean, it barely rains for months in places like Valencia. And what happens is that hot, humid air builds and builds and builds over the Mediterranean Sea. And then at the end of the summer, cold air from the jet stream collides with hot air from the Mediterranean, and that creates this torrential downpour, a Dana. Like I said, that is nothing new. I remember them from when I was a kid. It's really very impressive rain. But this Dana was different. It was historical. In one region, an entire year's worth of rain fell in 8 hours. Oh. It's really hard to imagine that kind of water. But for listeners who've experienced horrific floods in their own region in the recent years, it was about double to triple as much water as these very extreme floods in Germany in 2021. Also about double as much rain as the more recent floods in Central Eastern Europe just in the past couple of months. And on top of that, this is not a place where it rains that much. The long, dry summers basically bake the soil into this dry, hard surface. So when that rain falls, it can't be absorbed. And that makes it all worse. It just runs across the ground. And what you saw now is just huge waves of water, meters high, in places where it wasn't even raining.
Jesus. So this was always the kind of level of storm that was going to require people to, I don't know, stay home or be evacuated, or maybe a combination of both. But was the scale of this disaster inevitable?
So a major problem is that despite the predictions from IMET, there had been no official warning from the Valencian government. And so most people had no idea what was coming. There are videos surfacing where you see people trying to cross the streets or trying to drive their cars in maybe, 15 centimeters of water. Definitely something you'd notice, but this is a fairly normal sight in this region at this time of year. These people would have had no reason to believe it was more extreme today. So they just carried on trying to get home. And then minutes later, you see these people, some of them wading, some of them in their cars, swept away in water that is suddenly meters high. They had no idea what was coming for them.
But you said the weather agency had been warning the regional government in Valencia that this was coming, no? Like, why didn't that regional government put out clearer warnings to people?
Yeah, I should be clear that no one, not even IMET, the weather agency, could have imagined what was happening, like how this would actually play out. And it was always going to be an enormous disaster. And there's a lot of questions we still have, but there are some things that have become clear. Our former guest and Politico reporter Aitor Hernandez Morales has done an incredible recreation, which we will share in the show notes. But basically, starting Friday, the 25th of October, the weather agency starts sending urgent warnings about this huge storm. On Monday, they warned of significant danger in Valencia specifically, and they asked regional authorities to start planning for this. The storm hits at 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning, and IMET is already posting footage on its social media, and it sends another warning to the regional government of extreme danger. But the Valencian government does not send out these warnings through their own channels. In fact, the Valencian government does not issue an official warning. Valencia's president, Carlos Mazón, he issued a statement saying that there was no material damage at around 1 p.m. And it's unclear how much he knew at that point. But we do know that there were warnings, and we'll get into who was responsible for what in a minute, but it is clear that there were serious failures and that those failures were not on the part of the weather agency. So it's been raining since 8 in the morning, and by the afternoon, things start to get really dire. It's only at 8:12 p.m., 12 hours after the rain starts, that the official government warning goes off.
Wow.
And it warns people to stay home or inside where they are, to not go to work. Obviously, at this point, it was way too late. The storm has been going on for 12 hours. Most people have already been out to work and are maybe not finished, maybe already going back again. We now know that people had already died. And one thing that really stays with me is this quote from a Valencian man who says, "I was already trapped in my car for an hour with water up to my neck when the alarm went off on my phone. You do not need to tell me then that there is a storm and it's not safe." Unfortunately, there are many, many thousands more like him.
Okay, so it's now been a week. Where are we at now? To what extent are people's lives returning to normal at this stage? I mean, I guess still barely at all, right?
Oof. I mean, normalcy is very, very far from where we're at. People's houses, the streets, it's all completely filled with mud, with broken furniture. There are a lot of houses that are still blocked and people can't get in or out. And that mud is filled with sewage. So it's been a week. The people on the ground are talking about an unimaginable smell. And they're not even close to getting basic needs met. I mean, some people don't have drinking water, they don't have toilets, they don't have showers. At the time of recording, a week later, portable toilets and drinking water are just starting to arrive in a serious way from the authorities. There are reports and concerns that people are getting sick because of how much sewage is in this water. And I mean, in terms of normalcy, many people have just lost their homes, lost everything that they own. To be clear, at this point now, thousands of military personnel have arrived in Valencia, but there are a lot of people who are just seeing help show up now. And it's clear that that's just really not enough. 5 days after the flood, there were people in the worst hit town who had not seen a single rescue worker. There were towns that had been fully flooded where the first people to arrive were Catalan journalists. There was another case where a group of French firemen showed up, expecting to help the local authorities and finding out that they were the only ones there. Wow. What you're also seeing is people literally trying to clean kilometers of sewage with supermarket gloves and mops and brooms. It's just a task that will never, ever be finished like that. You need serious machines, you need high-pressure hoses, you need drinking water tanks, not stuff from the supermarket. Then there's people who don't have enough food, and I think that's really where the shock comes in. This is all happening around the third largest city in Spain. Spain is the 16th largest economy in the world. And the question many people are asking is, how can it be that in one of the worst moments in Spain's modern history, people are left to fend for themselves? And why has the help been so grassroots, just neighbor to neighbor?
So it's clear that the Valencian regional government got a lot wrong in terms of telling people just how bad the storm was going to be. But are they the only ones responsible for this and the way that it's been handled since? Or are there other people that the blame should be pointed at?
Yeah, that's where things start to get complicated very quickly. As I described, it's clear that the Valencian government has made serious mistakes. And people are also wondering, what is the role of Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez? Sánchez himself has tried to call for national unity and said, there'll be time for the authorities to evaluate later, and this is now the moment for saving lives. But that's not enough for a lot of people. And it is complicated because Spain's government is so decentralized. So there's the national government led by Sánchez, and then each region has its own government. So the government of Valencia, that's led by Valencian President Carlos Mazón. That is currently a coalition between the Conservative People's Party and the far-right Vox Party. And The Valencian government categorized this storm as a level 2 disaster, which means that they remain the executive decision maker. It's only once a level 3 disaster is declared that the national government takes over. But obviously, a lot of people are asking, if this isn't a level 3, what the hell is?
Right.
And could the national government have overruled them? And the answer is that legally Sanchez could have overruled Valencia's president, but a lot of flood experts from around Europe say that it is better to leave the regional government in charge because they know the terrain, there's an established network of people, and you would lose a lot of time you need to save lives, if you've got all of this new staff arriving. But what is quickly becoming very ugly, a horrible political feud, is that it's clear that Mathon's regional government has made enormous and deadly mistakes before, during, and after the storm. So even if there were good reasons for it, at what point is it, nonetheless, time for Sanchez's government to step in?
And what has Sanchez and the central government, what have they been doing in the midst of all of this?
So as I said, immediately afterwards, he called for unity, and initially Mathon did the same. But now Mathon has been moving to blaming the national government, and in turn, the national leader of Mathon's People's Party has called for this crisis to be managed at a national level, which would basically remove Mathon from making executive decisions. So even within the parties, there's a lot of conflict going on. Also at the national level, the director of military emergencies went on TV yesterday to say his soldiers came in as soon as possible, and he just didn't get the green light from the regional government before. So political finger pointing is rampant, and all of this, while many people are still missing, and many more are literally hungry, thirsty, waiting around in drying sewage and waiting for someone to help them and hear if everyone is okay.
So I guess it's fair to say that the people of Valencia, they must be feeling incredibly angry and frustrated with their leaders right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's always such a hard question to answer. People are obviously feeling many things, and different people are holding different people accountable. But there's a massive, massive shock, and I think it's safe to say that there is a huge amount of anger at how unprofessionally this whole thing has been managed. So rage at Valencian President Mathon and his government for downplaying the flood, rage at Sanchez and his national government for not overriding Valencian government, rage at all kinds of local authorities, the firemen, the military for not arriving more quickly. The king and queen showed up in one of the worst hit villages a couple of days ago, and they were yelled at that they were murderers and had mud thrown at them. Those leaders had to be evacuated. There are some official news reports that the people who perpetrated the violence were wearing far-right symbols. And I absolutely want to be clear that violence against anyone, leaders, royals, whoever, is never good. But I think it's fair to say that emotions and tensions are unimaginably high, and it's very understandable that people are absolutely furious.
And we haven't even begun to think beyond like the immediate rescue and cleanup. Like people are going to need help for months, no?
Totally. I mean, it makes sense to be focusing on missing people and dying people right now. But I mean, this is an enormous, not just emotional, but financial hit. Like loads and loads of people have lost everything. They've lost their cars, they've lost their homes. The people out were more likely to be working class people because those are the people still out at work at 8 p.m. That's not even thinking about the biodiversity, how many millions of animals were killed also by this flood. It is going to be a very, very long road, and it's not clear what kind of support people can expect and who is going to pay for all of this.
So these days, when a big disaster like a flood strikes, I instantly think climate change. But is that how people in Spain are understanding this disaster? Are they thinking about this as a disaster that happened because of climate change?
Yeah, I thought that was pretty remarkable that already days after this storm started, so not even when it finished, the World Weather Attribution Agency, which is a group of scientists, came out to say this storm was twice as likely because of climate change and 12% stronger because of climate change. We've seen for a long time journalists being incredibly cautious and adding caveats in every article about, you know, these storms may be more likely because of climate change. And I think that time is and should be over. I think the more accurate thing for journalists to now communicate is, listen, this catastrophic storm causing hundreds of people to die, thousands more losing their homes. There are already now twice as many storms like that because our governments are not cutting emissions fast enough and also not requiring companies to reduce emissions. That still doesn't say this storm was 100% caused by climate change, but it is true, and it gives a completely different message. What I also thought was really fascinating is already 2 days ago, I read journalists on the ground saying there is a very real chance that this changes the way that people vote. Obviously, it's too soon to say, but this is a region that voted for right-wing parties that downplay the climate crisis. And those citizens are now completely enraged. It's obviously all speculation, but there is a very real possibility that this could all change what Spain accepts and how much climate action citizens are willing to tolerate. Now, as I said at the start, seeing people picked up by firemen in uniforms that are so familiar and fearing for people that I care about, seeing people I know sharing videos, I can't deny that that really does hit me on an emotional layer that is just really hard to get to when you're reading about climate disasters happening all the time all over the world. But I also know that this kind of fear, that's something that's already been going on for decades in Sudan, in Brazil, in Pakistan, in the US. We're really the last continent to see such deadly extremes. And I was thinking, should I talk about the emotional side of it? But I actually think it's really important to use the huge shock and grief constructively. A few weeks ago on the show, we spoke to Andri about how we have to tell stories about climate change we can actually feel. And then just 2 weeks ago, our interview was about how Switzerland, one of the richest governments in the world, rejected a court order to reduce climate emissions more quickly. And well, I was already angry to hear about that, but now, in the face of these storms, that anger is definitely bigger. Like, this is what it means if our European governments, some of the richest countries in the world with the highest emissions per capita, this is what is happening already now because they're not acting more quickly.
Yeah.
And given that it's my job to make sure people understand what's happening in the world, I don't know anymore that it feels more professional not to tell you that I'm angry and that I cry about this. I mean, we all knew this was coming, but it's absolutely terrifying and devastating that the climate crisis is here.
It really is. And it is really jarring to think about us as the last continent to see these deadly extremes, when at the same time, Europe is currently the fastest warming continent on Earth, right? So it is terrifying to think about, but I think we're going to be seeing disasters of this scale more and more in the years to come. And I just don't know what to do with that information.
Absolutely. I think we're all going to have to figure that out together. I'm not going to try and wrap this up as a positive ending because this is all very horrible. But with all of this political finger pointing and failures and all kinds of ugly things, it's really easy to feel pretty hopeless about humanity right now. And one thing that really, really moved me is the scenes of thousands of Valencians from towns close to those hardest hit, walking for kilometers with those supermarket mops and gloves and bottles of water in their hands. And just in the absence of coordinated official government response, it was incredibly moving to see people putting themselves out on the line like this. I wanted to close this bad week with a recording of a group of people who were cleaning the streets as best they could and stopped to sing the anthem of Valencia, which translates to, "In one voice, brothers come. In workshops and in the countryside, you hear the songs of love and peace." Katie, who has had a good week?
I'm going to give my good week to the President of Moldova, Maia Sandu, who has just won a second term in office after a super tense election campaign. We talked a little bit a couple of weeks back about the first round of this election because that was held on the same day as a referendum on whether to change Moldova's constitution so that it can push ahead with its bid to join the European Union. That referendum, you might remember, passed by the thinnest of razor-thin margins, 50.46% of the vote.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And given that getting Moldova into the EU is basically Maia Sandu's entire political raison d'etre, the closeness of that referendum result was seen as putting a lot more pressure on Sandu in the second round of the presidential election on Sunday, and maybe even putting a question mark over whether she could actually win.
But she did actually win this second round. Was it as close as the referendum was?
No, it was a slightly more relaxing win than she got in the referendum a couple of weeks back. At the time of recording, the Election Commission website still describes the results as preliminary, even though 100% of them have now been counted. But Sandu finished on just over 55% of the vote, against, surprise, surprise, a candidate who leans towards Russia, the socialist candidate Alexander Stoyanoglu. And so the main takeaway that is coming out of this election result is that it is a decisive middle finger being raised at the Kremlin. And that is because not only did Russia's preferred candidate lose, but because there is abundant evidence that Russia interfered with this election and with the referendum a couple of weeks ago. This is, after all, a country that sits on the map between Ukraine and Romania. It's incredibly close to areas that are being bombed in Ukraine, like Odessa, but it's also right up against the edge of the EU. So it's pretty fair to say that it has a strategic location. And of course, Moldova was a part of the Soviet Union once upon a time. So it's very much part of the landmass that Putin would still like to consider to be under his sphere of influence. But yeah, despite all of this interference in Moldova's presidential election and the referendum, people have voted twice now over the last couple of weeks to stick with the path that Sandu has set the country on, this path of seeking a close relationship with the EU over a close relationship with Moldova's former Soviet masters in Moscow. It's pretty clear from these votes that, given the choice, a majority of Moldovans choose Europe.
Oof. I mean, it's just such a different outcome than the other election that we talked about just last week that also felt like a choice between Russia and the EU, the election in Georgia.
Yeah, it's really different. So that election in Georgia, as we discussed last week, also appears to have been heavily interfered with. In Georgia, there were lots of reported cases of people being paid to vote in favor of the pro-Russian ruling party, Georgian Dream. In Moldova, there was, if anything, even more glaring evidence of an attempt to influence how people voted, in that Maia Sandu's arch-nemesis, who is this oligarch called Ilan Shor, he lives in Russia these days, he spent the campaign openly offering on Telegram to pay people to vote against the EU in the referendum. There were also dozens of people stopped by customs officers earlier in the year, coming back into Moldova from Russia carrying 10,000 euros each, money that was destined for buying votes. And in total, Moldovan officials estimate that Moscow invested about $100 million in trying to influence this election campaign, and in particular, the EU referendum, which is pretty crazy given that, as our producer Wojciech pointed out, the presidential campaigns of all candidates combined in these Moldovan presidential elections only cost together like $2 million. So Russia hasn't really got a very good return on its investment if it did put $100 million into trying to rig these votes. What makes Moldova different from Georgia? I mean, one really obvious thing is that in Georgia, the pro-Kremlin party were already in power, right? With all of the advantages that brings. Whereas in Moldova, Maia Sandu was by far the most popular candidate. Like in the first round, she got 43% of the vote already, compared to just 26% for the pro-Russia guy. So Moscow would have had to really, really rig the vote an insane amount just to get the guy to win. The other big difference between Moldova and Georgia is this huge diaspora that Moldova has. A quarter of the population live abroad, lots of them in Romania and Italy and other EU countries. And those Moldovans living abroad voted really, really heavily in favour of Maia Sandu and EU membership, because a lot of them live in the EU already. They can see what it would look like. They represented about 20% of the people who voted on Sunday. And quite simply, if they hadn't been there, Sandu would have lost. There was quite a moving quote from Georgia's president, Salome Zurabishvili, who is against the ruling party and believes very fiercely that they rigged it. She said that Moldova was saved by its diaspora voters. Georgia also has a sizable diaspora, but a lot of those voters were blocked from voting. So they weren't able to vote for Europe in the same kind of way. And actually, it's worth noting that Russia does seem to have attempted to minimize the number of Moldovans voting abroad as well by phoning in bomb threats to polling stations in Germany and the UK. But it wasn't enough. They voted in absolutely huge numbers for Maia Sandu.
God, that's a weird combination of relaxing and totally unrelaxing.
You're welcome.
Okay, but do people actually like Sandu? Are they enthusiastic to vote for her? Or is it more that they really don't like Russia and the pro-Russian candidate?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Sandu is definitely a darling in the West because she is so pro-EU and she's a technocrat. She used to work at the World Bank. And she came to power promising to rid Moldova of corruption and get the country ready to join the EU. In reality, a lot of Moldovans are quite disappointed with what she has been able to achieve. It is still an extremely poor country where a lot of young people feel like their best hopes lie in emigrating. And after she got elected, Russia really punished Moldova for turning away from it by turning off the gas taps and whacking up the price of this energy that Moldova was at the time incredibly dependent on. So Sandu had to deal with an immediate economic crisis. And that only got worse when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Moldova previously had a load of trade with Ukraine and Russia, which has been drastically cut back. It's also taken in a huge number of Ukrainian refugees, given that it's a small country. And so things have got harder under Sandu in a lot of ways when she promised better times. And so a lot of people have been understandably disappointed, even if it's not all her fault. Her party also seen as kind of elitist, and for people who live in cities, maybe Western educated, have white-collar jobs and generally aren't very in touch with the lives of the average Moldovan. And to be honest, there are quite a few Moldovans who have been questioning, given the circumstances, whether this approach of aggressively going after EU membership is the right move, given that their neighbour Ukraine has been invaded with incredibly high human costs. Again, it's a bit like what we talked about in Georgia last week. There are a lot of people who think it's just more pragmatic not to fight with Russia. For what it's worth, Sandu's opponent, this socialist guy, Alexander Stoyanoglu, he's not like a cartoon of a Kremlin stooge. He doesn't, go around wearing an I Heart Putin t-shirt or whatever. He has refused to criticize Russia for invading Ukraine, but mostly his argument is that Moldova should keep strong ties with both Russia and the West. Sandu has, of course, just accused him of being like a Russian Trojan horse. But I don't know. I don't want to overplay how much of a threat to her he actually represented, because he's not very charismatic. He wasn't an especially inspiring speaker. He gave a pretty lackluster debate performance just before the election, which, okay, like maybe it didn't change anyone's mind, but it might have made people who were planning to vote for him less likely to actually show up and do it.
So what happens now? I mean, I guess Sandu is going to push ahead with this plan and try to get Moldova into the EU?
Yeah, very much so. And she's being super ambitious about it. Moldova only officially started accession negotiations in June, and she wants the country to be in the EU by 2030.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, given how long the EU has kept various candidate countries waiting for years and years and years, I'm not sure how doable that will be. And there is a huge amount that needs to get done in terms of getting the economy ready and the legal system and everything else. The EU is actually trying to speed that along. So the Commission just announced it wants to give Moldova 1.8 billion euros a year to help boost the economy. But there's a lot to do in 6 years. And in the meantime, there is no sign that Russia is just going to back off and leave Moldova alone. They do not consider Moldova to be lost. And so Sandu's team are apparently fully braced for yet more Kremlin interference next year when Sandu's party are going to be trying to get re-elected in parliamentary elections. It never stops.
Oh no, there are just more elections. This feels like a result that should be celebrated. And at the same time, there are so many elections that have just been so close recently, and that really doesn't feel that relaxing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a sign of just how polarized Moldova is that the referendum in particular was this close. And obviously it's far from the only country that has recently had a very, very close election result. You know, I am talking to you from a country that has a really messy three-way split in politics right now. I think we're going to look back at this time and realize that polarization was like one of the main stories of the times that we are currently living in. But I don't know, this is Good Week, so I am going to push that depressing thought back under the carpet because I do think it is worth celebrating this victory for a president that wants very badly for her country to be part of Europe. And she did that despite the best efforts of a very big and very powerful enemy. So congratulations to Maia Sandu.
Congratulations, and thank you for giving us some good news, Katie.
The only reason that Katz and I are in your ears right now, talking to each other across a couple of borders, talking about this continent in all of its breadth and complexity, from Spain to Moldova, Russian interference to climate change, with a little bit of cinema coming up in a minute. The only reason that we're able to do the research that goes into every episode and to pay everyone involved for the time that it takes to make it is because of our listeners. We've gone through some times in recent years of being lucky when it comes to applying for grants and winning some little pots of money to help us fund our very small, very proudly independent operation. 2024 was not one of those years, unfortunately. And this year, about 80% of our funding is coming directly from you guys. So thank you for helping us to make this weird, highly informative, extremely varied podcast about Europe. We're incredibly grateful. And this week, we'd like to thank the latest people who have signed up on Patreon to send a little bit of cash our way. Whenever Wojciech is co-presenting with me, he gets a weird kick out of saying the names of our supporters. But Katz, I don't know if you find it quite as thrilling as he does.
I don't think I can compete with Wojciech, but I can try.
All right, would you like to do the honors?
Yes, please. Many, many thanks to Julie, Guy, Steph, Jeremy, and Philip for being the latest people to join in supporting our show.
If you like what we do and you have any spare cash at all, we would love it if you could join the ranks of these lovely, generous people. It's very, very easy, and you can do it in pretty much any currency. All the info is at patreon.com/Europeans podcast. I have to read a lot of reports for my job, but genuinely, I have never had so much fun reading a report as I did reading the report that we're about to talk about with Anna and Rikke. It is called European Children's Film in Focus, and it was a report commissioned by Kids Radio. They are an organization representing the kids' film industry across Europe. You might remember the interview that we did back in July with their project manager, Anna Schultka, about why European cinema feels so different from Hollywood. This is the second half of our collaboration with Kids Radio, and it's a conversation about this report that they commissioned about the films that kids across Europe, aged 7 to 11, are watching and what they like watching and what the grown-ups who actually make these films can do to make better films for kids. Kids Radio commissioned a Danish company called Publikum to work on this report. They do audience research, so they work with the producers of films and TV shows and even video games to try and figure out what their target audience actually wants. And for this report, they spoke to nearly 400 kids in 12 different European countries, all across the continent. And the results were very enlightening and in a lot of cases very charming. There's quite a lot of direct quotes from the kids in the report, and some of them are very funny and quite savage, actually, in their criticism. It also really hit home when I was reading this report just how different the experience of being a kid is now compared to when I was a kid and we had access to, well, in the UK, we had 4 channels. And I also had some Disney movies on videotape that I would just rewind and watch over and over again. And the kids today have access to this like endless universe of content on streaming platforms and on YouTube, which, when you think about it, is kind of wild. Like, how does that change the way that they think about entertainment?
And what did it do to our brains to watch the same film like 200 times?
Gave us attention to detail, Katz. That's what I like to think. But is it also a good thing that across Europe they're increasingly watching the same content? Anna was in Amsterdam last week to launch this report at a kids' film industry event alongside Rikke Flodin. She is the researcher from Publicum who led the work on it. And so they met up in person with Dominic. I joined via the internet. And Katz, you were also there in person, recording the interview.
Yes, I won't take much credit because I'm really just holding the microphone. But I will say, I definitely don't have children. And no offense to you and your lovely child, but I'm at the age where I'm feeling slightly outnumbered and slightly aggressively child-free. Nonetheless, I thought it was absolutely fascinating. I was genuinely really, really interested to hear what is going on in cinema for children between 7 and 11. Which I wouldn't have necessarily seen coming. So I highly recommend.
Yeah, it was a very enjoyable conversation, and I hope you enjoy it too.
Anna, Rikke, thank you so much for joining us today. So nice to be with you here in Amsterdam in person. I wanted to start by asking you, Anna, why did you commission this report in the first place?
We did it because we wanted to actually know about what the children in Europe think and not only trust our gut feeling or trust what was true 20 years ago. That was something that really went on my nerves, going to events and people that have been in the industry for long saying, but I know this from experience. And I was always like, are children still the same children that we have been when we were children? I don't think so. So I wanted to have proof. This is why we got Rikke on board.
So this report finds loads of similarities in what kids watch and how they watch it across Europe. What are the main things that you found that kids have in common?
I think one of the main things that they have in common is a shared interest for stories that offer them challenges through adventures and missions. So we can see that moving from 7 to 11 years, a lot of things happen in their life worlds. But one of the things that really comes across is that where the youngest group are okay with stories that feels more repetitive, as soon as they get maybe 8 or older, they look for challenging narratives. And that's where the adventures and the missions come into play, because that's what drives surprises and suspense and pure entertainment as well.
Kids these days have all these different streaming platforms at their fingertips. But do kids still go to cinemas to watch films? Is the cinema staying relevant for children?
I would say yes, because yes, they do have access to what they think is an endless universe of content, and they can stream freely. At least that's what they think, because often they don't know that mom and dad are paying. So they have free access to everything. But then when they talk about the cinema, they always talk about it with a very specific mentioning of when the last time they went to the cinema was. So it becomes this social event for them that they remember so clearly. Whether they were talking about being to the cinema last week, last month, maybe last Christmas, they still remember exactly when they went the last time. And I think that's because it's a social event where they also often get popcorns and nice seatings, and they get to watch something on a really big screen and do something together with people that they like. So in that sense, I think the cinemas hold a really important social position in their life.
And I really think that we need to talk about this aspect more, because there are a lot of people who are asking the question exactly like you just did with, is cinema dead? Do we actually need to do this anymore? And I would say yes, because everything that they consume, on their phones, on the streamers, on the apps, is a very lonesome thing to do. And we're all getting more lonely each day, I would say. So investing in those, in the social component of the whole thing, of film watching, also when they're watching a film at home, you found out in the research that this is what they do with their family. When they're watching something by themselves, it's usually not film, it's series, it's shorts, it's TikTok. But when they're watching a film, they're watching it together.
When they are watching at home, across the continent, kids are watching via a lot of the same platforms: Netflix, Disney+, Amazon. So their experience of watching things on the screen at home is a lot more homogenized than we were kids when most European children were watching whatever their national broadcasters were putting out. Is this level of homogenization, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Or is it a bit of both?
But I think we really need to ask ourselves as Europeans what kind of culture we want to preserve in all of our European countries. Because most of the content, at least that is like on the forefront of the streamers, mostly is American. And I have nothing against American content, but I think there should be a variety. And when I hear people who produce content who work for big broadcasters, not national, but like international broadcasters, tell me that for a German audience, they rather take the American version of a show they produce and not the Dutch version of a show, because German children feel they can relate more to the American than to the Dutch because they're used more to watching those high school stories from the US. I feel like that is at least a challenge, if we don't want to call it a problem.
On the other hand, there are some benefits clearly from kids growing up being in touch with all this different content and all these different films from different cultures, right? I mean, there was something in your report that said something like 18% of Danish children aged 7 to 14 said they'd watched the Korean show Squid Game, which in itself is a bit terrifying because it's incredibly violent. But it's also interesting. What do you think it could mean to have a generation that from the very beginning are used to each other's cultures?
Maybe the German children will be more likely to watch American high school content than Dutch high school content, because at least they know how to decode the American high school setting. But I think in general, it's a good thing that they are more global than we were when we were children. In Denmark, I would watch Danish content, maybe some Swedish once in a while and Norwegian, but that would be where my world would end. And I think we're now looking into a generation that they have a global mentality. And that can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing, but it's just how it is. And we have to deal with it in one way or another, because they do feel more global and they look for global communities where they can share interest. And maybe it's extremely terrifying for people who make content for children that, I think actually the number is higher now, but almost 25% of the Danish 10 to 14-year-old watch Squid Games. It's not a show meant for them, but they have watched it. So it's just about be aware that things are happening really fast out there.
What I think is, even for me at least, more interesting about this fact with Squid Game is, why are they watching that? They want to watch a specific kind of content. They want to be challenged. They don't want to watch anything that they perceive as childish, is also something that you found out in the research. So it's really also about what we offer them, especially when it comes to publicly funded films and series, stuff that our national broadcasters produce. Often they are, I would say, scared to offer really challenging content because they fear that parents don't like it, that politicians don't like it, but they are kind of losing the interest of the children. So if they are not offering them this kind of challenging content, then the children will just go somewhere else and watch something that was not intended for them. So I think this is something that we also really need to discuss.
I think one of the things we also learned was that they don't mind watching stuff that is about children at all. But if the moment that they find out that it's an adult who made this for them because an adult wanted them to learn something, they're out. You've lost them already.
So essentially, they don't want to be patronized. They don't want their films to be educational. I can totally understand that. Yeah, and actually going back to the Squid Game thing, I haven't watched Squid Game myself yet because I think it's going to be too violent. I can't believe all these kids are watching it. It's terrifying.
You're such a scaredy cat, Dominic.
Thank you.
Did you find many differences between countries in terms of how kids watch stuff and what they want to watch?
We didn't find big differences in how they watch. So most children watch films with their families. So that's a social setting. They watch series alone or sometimes with friends. And that behavior goes across the different countries. Of course, there are differences in which platforms that are being mentioned. So what streaming platforms they have access to. But a lot of them also talk about YouTube and YouTube Shorts as one of the primary gateways to new content. We do see some differences in the type of content that they are curious about. So we see that, for instance, in Portugal, a lot of the children were talking about animation as something that they would really like to watch. We didn't see that in particular in the other countries. Mm-hmm. For Germany and for Switzerland, we saw that the children were really happy with more light-hearted content. So more of a feel-good stories and content that would be easy to access and nice to be around. We've also seen in other research that German children in general are a bit more scared of everything than we saw for some of the Eastern countries. They were really into what we called magical escapism. So everything that would be about more local myth or magical creatures or local fairy tales. And then in the northern part of the countries, they would be more into what we called extraordinary reality. So they would be into stories that would take place in a more elevated everyday narrative, but then offering some sort of escapism, so it's not social realistic content. So there are differences, definitely. And I think it's also really good to remember that kids are just as alike as they are different, just as adult audiences are.
What was really important to us is, even though you named all of those smaller differences right now, they really become a more European audience. And this is something that we kind of knew in our guts before, but that has been challenged by other people who said, I've been in the industry for 20 years and I know that this content will not work in that country. This isn't really something that we found in the research, but what we did find is that the children that were asked 7 to 11, 5 years apart, that is worlds apart. 7-year-olds and 11-year-olds, completely different worlds. So we see more differences in the age than in the nationality of the children.
Something I found really striking about this report is how adult the kids you interviewed sound when they talk about what they're watching. Like, they're so discerning. There was this one kid who was like, yeah, I'm a really big fan of Toshio Suzuki. He just sounds like some guy you might meet at a party smoking. I mean, like, were you surprised by how sophisticated the children were in how they think and talk about what they're watching?
So I've been doing this type of research for the last 4 years. So for me, it wasn't a surprise because children today in general, they have a really big vocabulary when it comes to content and entertainment. So they will talk about, oh, it's such a strong character development, or it's a really good script. Like, they will have all the different words and they will be very specific in what kind of genre elements that they're into, or CGI effects, or what studio is the best right now at making explosions. Like, they will be really into it. And I think it's a lot of it has to do with what the type of content that they meet on TikTok. So looking into behind the scene materials or people doing infosplainers. So I wasn't surprised, but I think I hope it's going to be a good eye-opener for the industry, that we really hope to engage in the research as well, or at least in the findings, to remind them that kids today are a challenging audience, and you have to work hard to make them get invested in your content.
You have kind of just answered this, but if there's one thing that European film producers take away from this report, what would it be?
My hope would be that the key takeaway would be take them seriously. They might be children, but take them seriously because they deserve that. They are as picky and as requiring as adult audiences are. And they are looking for challenging narratives, and they are looking to be stimulated and, most importantly, entertained. I think often we encounter really good intentions with people who make films for children, and that's great. They want some morality in the story and important learnings and how to cope with grief or love or coming out or parents getting divorced. And if you see the results from the research, there's one thing that the kids are agreeing on: entertainment comes first.
I absolutely agree. All us adults should constantly challenge our views on things, especially when it comes to young people, because things are moving so quickly that we can't rely on what we know when we were children. So really, you need to be on your toes all the time. If you want to do films or series or whatever for children, you might want to sign up as a volunteer in a kindergarten to go there and read them a book once a month. Or, I don't know, just try to keep in contact with them. And you might be surprised, there are people in kindergarten who really want to learn about death, which is a topic that you probably don't think would be something for children, but they are also losing pets, they're losing grandparents, sometimes parents, unfortunately. So offer them stuff that they are really interested in and stay in contact with them.
Powerful message for the film producers of Europe. I think it's a very clear task of what they need to do to create this content for our wonderful children. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really nice to speak to you.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you so much. It was very lovely to be here.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for giving a voice to the young European audiences.
I realised something from that interview, Katz.
What was it?
I think I'm a German child.
You mean you're a total scaredy cat?
I'm a total scaredy cat. Like, reading this description, gets scared easily, prefers feel-good content. I was like, yes, it's me.
That was the most important news takeaway for the past month.
Thank you so much to Anna and to Rikke for joining us. You will, of course, find a link to the report in the show notes, and it makes for very interesting reading, whether you have kids or not. For this week's edition of The Inspiration Station, we thought it would be fitting to bring you a couple of recommendations for European children's films that are widely available on streaming platforms. So we asked Anna to handpick a couple of her favourites to share with you. She is, after all, a bit of an expert. What's the first one, Katz?
The first one is the Dutch-German film called Salon, Romy, directed by Misha Kamp. I had to smile when I read this because Salon either means hairdresser or it's a rather outrageous snack that is a favorite among Dutch drunk people, where you basically eat a pile of like doner meat and lettuce and tomatoes and garlic sauce on a large bed of fries.
Oh, sounds so good.
Sadly, this film is referencing the option of the hairdresser.
Thank you for clarifying.
But it's good that you all know this now. Anna wrote us a little bit about why she liked this film so much. She said, Romy's Salon is a children's film that doesn't patronize its young audience. It trusts them to handle a tough topic, dementia, by giving real agency to the 10-year-old main character who faces her grandmother's illness. Personally, this film touched me deeply because I lost my own grandmother to dementia. And when I saw it at the festival, I couldn't stop crying. I really think adults will be able to relate with Romy because when facing this illness, we all experience the same helplessness. So, yeah, if you listened to the interview and were inspired to show your kids films that don't shy away from harder subjects, I think this is an excellent start.
Sounds really beautiful.
What was the other film, Katie?
Well, since I am a German child who prefers feel-good content, I'm going to give you more of a light-hearted recommendation from Anna. It is a fun, coming-of-age kind of film called How I Learned to Fly. And it's about a 12-year-old girl called Sofia. She's from Belgrade, and she's forced to spend the summer with her annoying grandma in Croatia. Eventually, she manages to get over her boredom and start making new friends and have fun until something difficult happens to the family. This film is a co-production between Serbia, Croatia, Bulgaria, and Slovakia. And Anna wanted to recommend it not just because it's great, but because it's a really nice example of a kids' film coming out of a part of Europe that doesn't produce that many children's films. Anna said that it took her to a cultural environment that she doesn't get to see very often. And she said, I think that is the beauty of European film. We can travel to other countries, experience other cultures without actually leaving the house. Apparently, this film was a massive hit at children's film festivals, but it didn't really reach a big audience in cinemas. It is now available, though, to stream in lots of countries, so hopefully lots of people can now discover it. It is called How I Learned to Fly, and it was directed by Radivoje Rasha Andrić. The screenplay is by Ljubica Vukovic. It's time for a happy ending, Katz. What have you got for me?
Yes, happy ending. This has been a really hard week filled with a lot of uncertainty. So rather than pulling a Dominic and ending with a sort of happy ending, we are going with full-on pure joy.
Yes, love it.
Now, as you may have noticed, we are currently at the end of peak pumpkin season. And what is one to do with these really very giant pumpkins? I actually learned this year that you can't choose to pick the pumpkins earlier. You have to wait until the stems change color. So you have no choice but to watch your pumpkins get meters large sometimes. Okay, maybe just 1 meter.
Oh, that's a good gardening fact. I had no idea.
Yeah, crazy. Yeah? So the classic solution is to make soup, but how much soup can you really make? So the town of Casterlet in Belgium has come up with an excellent alternative solution. Do you have any guesses?
I have no idea where this is going.
I thought so. Since 2008, Kasterlee started an annual pumpkin regatta, a relay kayak race with kayaks that are made out of hollowed out pumpkins.
What? Wait, how big does it need to be to work as a kayak?
I've seen pictures and they are definitely bigger than a meter in diameter, which is incredible. It's absolutely amazing. And the race has 4 categories: kids, men, women, and mixed, which I would like to add is more inclusive than the Tour de France. But anyway, apparently it's really quite difficult to kayak in a pumpkin because it doesn't have a front or a back. It just kind of spins. So there's quite some technique involved.
I'm just watching it. I just Googled it and I'm just watching a video. This is amazing.
Yeah, and so how it works is there are 4 people in each team who relay one after the other and apparently have a glorious time. They wear costumes, and meanwhile, a gleeful public watches on, eating all kinds of pumpkin-themed snacks. And when they get bored of watching the race, then they go and they have all kinds of pumpkin-themed fair games.
I love this so much. Also, why is Belgium so good at competitions? Didn't they also do... There was a happy ending a while back about the seagull impersonation competition that I think was also Belgian. Just incredible.
It is incredible, isn't it? They also have a jigsaw puzzle competition that I've been wanting to go to for a while. But anyway, pumpkin specific, as if this all wasn't good enough news, a participant told the Deutsche Welle that the pumpkins are certainly not wasted after the race. The seeds are saved to grow pumpkins for the next year, and the rest of the pumpkin is put back on the fields as fertilizer, a recycling inspiration to us all.
Fantastic.
The other thing I wanted to say is that the slugs were back. There was fear in the days before that there would not be enough pumpkins for the 80 teams to kayak in because of all of these slugs, but glorious. There were, in the end, enough giant pumpkins.
Did you choose this story specifically because there was a slug angle and you're convinced that we need to talk about slugs more on this podcast?
No, it was just a joyful, joyful coincidence, which obviously I had to include in the editorial process. My biggest congratulations go to the Kasterlee Pumpkin Regatta and all of the participants for creating some of the best news I have seen this week. Let's all go kayak in a pumpkin next year. There are 4 people on our team.
Deal. That is all we have time for this week. But before we go, I have a little teaser for you. Next week, in place of our usual podcast, you're going to be hearing a special announcement for something we are cooking up for next year that we are ludicrously excited about. I won't say any more, but look out for that conversation between Dominic and me and producers Katz and Wojciech in your feeds next Thursday. I think you're going to want to hear it.
Yes, see you next Thursday.
In the meantime, you can find us on a multitude of social media platforms, Instagram, Twitter, Mastodon, and in a secret Facebook group for supporters of the podcast. Thank you so much to Morgan Childs and to Katz for producing this week's podcast. And thank you also for joining me this week, Katz, while Dominic's away.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next week, everyone.
Hello.
Bye.